Has anyone ever called you stupid, ugly, weirdo, geek, or any sort of negative label? Did it make you feel kind of bad about yourself? Maybe you felt like that person or group of people had some sort of power over you that affected the way you saw yourself. And maybe that interaction affected your future interactions with other people. What if I told you you could take that power back? And what if I added that poetry is a surprising way to do so? I'm a poet and spoken word artist. And one of the first poems I ever performed at my very first poetry slam in the 9th grade was called She Ugly. She ugly, a common phrase she heard in middle school, and frankly, everyone is awkward in middle school, but she wasn't even a little cool. Like, she would go home and wonder if her parents wept for her because all Disney said was that only beautiful women become princesses, and if she couldn't be a princess, then what was left for her? She ugly. Those were the words of 9th grade me, back when all my poetry rhymed. In that poem, I talked about being bullied all through my childhood, and how the word ugly had negatively affected my self-esteem. How I heard it so often that I began to associate myself with it and use it to describe myself before anyone else could. I ended on a positive note, however, saying that I would not allow that word to sting anymore. I went to my second slam the next month, and I will never forget this, ever. A woman I did not know walked up to me and went, "She ugly." And I was like, whoa, 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 what's happening? Why is this woman calling me names? And so I look confused, of course, and she repeats it, getting closer to me and goes, "She ugly. I heard your poem last month. It really stuck with me." I was so relieved I didn't have to fight somebody at a poetry slam. But more importantly, I was excited that someone had remembered what I said. For the rest of high school, whenever someone would call me ugly, I would joke in my head and think, wow, my poem is really popular. Everyone knows it. I didn't know it then, but that was my first experience with word reclamation and the positive effect that it could have on my self-esteem. For that reason, I want to share with you the power of reclaiming words through poetry today. So, what exactly does it mean to reclaim or reappropriate a word? Linguistics scholars Galinsky, Bodenhausen, and Groom define reappropriation as the phenomenon whereby a stigmatized group revalues an externally imposed negative label. These scholars created a widely studied model for word reappropriation specifically for marginalized groups. The bottom level of this model is self-labeling, so when an individual decides to use a negative label for themselves. Me calling myself ugly would be a low-stakes example. Another low-stakes example of this would be the word geek. Geek used to be such a mean thing to call someone, and now plenty of people self-identify as geeks. It's basically cool to be a geek. And given these examples, we know that word reappropriation is not something new. People and groups across time have always tried to find ways to revalue the words used against them. One example of this is the word queer. Queer has a long history as a derogatory term, and now, thanks to scholars and activists who have pushed and redefined and shaped that word to put it into the mainstream, plenty of people use queer to self-identify, taking away the stigma associated with that label. Another example, in 2016, the phrase nasty woman. It was immediately given a positive connotation by many feminists who, in a span of a year, put the phrase on book covers, t-shirts, TV shows, all sorts of places, and it was redefined in Nina Donovan's viral poem titled Nasty Woman. Another example of how poetry is constantly at the forefront of reappropriation. Now, as you move higher on this level of this model, there are plenty of places where things get more complex. Group success compared to individual success at reclaiming words can vary. And reclaiming a slur or hate speech is a little harder than reclaiming a mean word like ugly or geek. But I want to keep the conversation on individual reclamation because that is where change can start in your life right now. Now, I'm sure you're wondering, okay, this all sounds great, but what does it have to do with me? How can I benefit from reappropriating words? Well, I have 3 ways that word reappropriation can positively affect you. And the first 2 go hand in hand. They are identity formation and self-esteem. Growing up, I was told, as I'm sure many of you were told, that words can't hurt me. Oh, it's just a word, let it go, move on, right? But the truth is, words do hurt. Words have meaning, and the ones that we attach to ourselves and other people affect the way that we move around in the world. On this subject, linguist John E. Joseph explains that our very sense of who we are, where we belong and why, and who we associate with, all have language at their center. Similarly, cognitive researcher Adam M. Kroom explains that the target of a slur can end up with a damaged sense of self-perception and self-esteem. His research shows that being negatively labeled can not only affect you in that moment, but it can have an effect on you for the rest of your life. Such an experience is highlighted in Countee Cullen's famous poem from 1925 during the Harlem Renaissance titled Incident, where Cullen shares, "Now I was 8 and very small, and he was no whit bigger, and so I smiled, but he poked out his tongue and called me nigger. I saw the whole of Baltimore from May until December. Out of everything that happened there, that's all I can remember." Incidents like these can stick with a person and overshadow other experiences. But when we can control the labels used against us, we can increase our self-esteem and our overall self-perception. The final reason is power. Reclaiming a negative label is a way for an individual to subvert the power move that is calling someone a name. Calling someone a name is just a way to put them on their place in some supposed hierarchy and demean them, right? One example of this subversion that Galinsky and his colleagues use is an episode of The Simpsons, where Homer gets mad at a gay person for self-identifying with the word queer, telling that person, "You can't say that, that's our word for you." Because Homer did not have a tool to express his superiority to this person anymore, he became upset. Now, there are exceptions, of course, but reappropriation often comes with an increase in perceived power for the person doing the self-labeling. For me, poetry allows me to reimagine the world around me, to create something new or repurpose something old. I find poetry to be the perfect vehicle for reappropriation because poets are constantly challenging and redefining language. There are so many examples of poets I admire who have redefined and challenged the constructs of labels and words, just like Brittany Rose Capri in the poem We House defines house as in our skin is not for mourning, as in drum beats, as in we still don't need to know the same language to speak. Antonio de Jesus Lopez's book of poetry, Hintification, reimagines a world and a word that is the opposite of gentrification. And Danez Smith, in the poetry book Homie, imagines a slur used against gay men to mean akin to a king, mighty, different, a good kind. Plenty of people have spoken on poetry's ability to subvert language, but I particularly love Rita Dove's phrasing when she says that poets have the power to enact change. A writer can make the word dark mean something positive. You can relieve a word like hysterical of its misogynistic implications. You can make the language your own. That is the power of poetry. I'd like to conclude now with a poem of my own, starting with naming. The American Ornithological Association names and renames birds when they encounter new relevant information. That is how the whiskey jack became the Canada jay, became the gray jay, became the Canada jay. Again, I'm regurgitating this information from Google because my rabbit hole searching led me to discover the AOS's most recent dilemma, a campaign to change the common names of birds named after the people who discovered them to something more appropriate for a bird. I imagine the AOS to be a room full of men ruminating on the use of maroon versus sanguine as they come up with titles for animals who will never ever answer to either one of those words. And I started to wonder, what makes a name appropriate for a bird? But I don't watch birds. I was, however, reminded of a time that I spent watching kids closely, learning more and more about their idiosyncrasies with each passing day and using those to tailor my interactions with them, making notes like, Kyla will always turn her fruit cup upside down on the table, so don't give her one without supervision. If Bryson doesn't have his fidget spinner, he will pull up the carpet instead, so keep an extra. And Julie. I had a lot of notes about Julie. Every day, something new about Julie. Julie won't sit. Julie won't listen. Julie won't eat. Julie won't answer me when I say, Julie, what's wrong? What do you need? At the end of the summer, a kid came running in from playtime to tell me, Juju fell down and got hurt. I asked, who? Julie, she answered. We call her Juju. I approached the scene, Band-Aids and a wipe in hand, and I said, here, Juju. She hears Juju and blushes slightly. From the ground, she looks up and asks me, how you know my name? And I apologized for going off my roster and never even asking. I made a new note that day. Juju just wants to be called by her name. I think if we listened, the birds would tell us. In college, I was told I couldn't have my preferred name on my diploma, as if what I call myself matters less than what the government does. A girl called Jae did all the work and was erased from the proof, and admin tells me it's just easier to track this way, and I'm sure it is, but I counter with so. Is a name only about control? I'm called what I am called for a reason, and who has the power to call me if not me? We assign names to birds as an attempt to classify them, and we rename them because we cannot possibly. We do the same to people. Assigning names for easy classification instead of calling someone's name because you want to relate to them. So I finally asked the kids their names. I found out that Bryson goes by his middle one, but only around his friends. And no, I don't count as that right now, but I might one day. And Adrina is pronounced Adrina and not Adrina. And Brielle associates her government name with being in trouble, so she's just like Brie if I'm not mad at her. And Kyla is cool with Kyla, but she wouldn't mind a cool nickname if I give her one, so I call her Killa Kyla, and we laugh every time. I feel closer to them all. I tell them to hold their names to their chests and protect them because the world, I say, will try to assign you so many you'll forget what your real one is. If you don't name yourself, someone else will. You'll fall into the lazy classifications of others who could never understand the fullness of you, so they give you a box and get mad if you don't fit in it, and I've named myself so I remember myself. So I don't answer to just anything. And I'm saying, if we listen, I think the birds might just tell us all their names.